rise to participate in the debate on what is not an ideal situation, but in some senses, I suppose you would hope this would be a salutary lesson about the abject failure of this philosophy of privatisation for privatisation's sake. Now, we've been lectured over several months by the Honourable Chris Rath on the ideals of the free market and the benefits to the consumer and the public on the operation of markets, efficient allocation of resources, all that sort of stuff you see in first-year economics textbooks. But when this becomes an ideological obsession, that is the transfer of public monopoly wealth, and I stress monopoly, that is a provision of a good and service which is not subject to normal market competition, to the point where in this particular situation you actually have to go back and undo a deal you've done and compensate the people that you sold it to because it's dysfunctional in a market sense. So we've got this situation now, this bizarre situation where the government sold off the Port of Newcastle on the basis that they restricted container movements to 50,000 to protect the monopoly territory of two other port operators that they'd previously sold to. And then when it's dysfunctional, when we find out that it's not productive and giving the public benefit to that part of New South Wales, the Hunter region, the Newcastle, then we have to try and unravel it at the behest of very strong campaigning from the local members up in that region, and accede to the requests of the lower house member Piper, who's brought this bill on. And the idea that after all this, we're having a debate, and we welcome the debate. We're going into an election campaign and we know we're on a winner here. We welcome the debate. But the idea that the government would double down after all this, and this isn't, the timing of this, Mr. President, is exquisite in a sense, because it highlights the futility of the privatisation obsession. Probably the worst exemplar of privatisation in the history of New South Wales, perhaps Australia, perhaps globally. And the government, in debates we heard here today, yesterday, the day before, over the last few months, in fact doubling down on their privatisation agenda. On several occasions when we've put it to the government as to whether or not they still believe privatisation is the way to go, they come back to us with this idea of asset recycling. We've heard it from the Leader of the Government, we've heard it from the Honourable Chris Rath, we've heard it from several members on that side, that we absolutely think that privatisation has been a great idea because we can sell all these public assets and we can use the money to put into other productive public assets is the philosophy. But in fact what they've done is used it to purchase monopoly assets, which in turn have not given the benefit to the public that was stated when the original program was put on the agenda. And you've only got to look at toll roads, as we've said on many times. The idea that you would sell, for example, electricity assets, then build a road and sell it to the private sector, get the private sector to build a road, and then put it on a 50-year lease so that the poor old travelling public has to get on that same road and pay it back through the nose for an asset that they should have owned in the first place. This is not a good use of the proceeds of privatisation. I don't think the public have benefited at all, and I don't think anyone in New South Wales driving across monopoly toll roads paying thousands of dollars a year would think, oh, that was a good use of our electricity asset sales, particularly when they're paying through the roof for the electricity prices that they used to have control over by virtue of the fact that the government used to recognise the fact that this is a monopoly asset and a key input into the economy. and that those prices would have been under their own control by virtue of that ownership. So I don't think that the public thinks that this is a good idea at all. So we've got this idea where we sell public assets that are not subject to competition to the private sector, who then use that monopoly power to control prices to their own benefit. And if you look at the electricity sector, we sold off first the generation, then the retail, and then the poles and wires. So that monopoly power was used to increase prices, maintain a profit to the private operator at the expense of the New South Wales public. And again, same with the toll roads. And now we've got this situation with the Port of Newcastle, where the government is actually having to potentially make up the difference in compensation to the other ports, because they've had to unravel the terrible, terrible deal that they made for a short-term sugar hit to the budget. And what's important from these debates is that we actually learn the lesson and we act based on the facts and the economic circumstances, not on ideology. Now, let me make it clear. On this side of the House, we are not obsessed with public ownership for public ownership's sake. There are large swathes of the economy where the government should not be involved in. The free market actually does work in a lot of circumstances, in fact, in most circumstances. But where you have a public interest, a clear public interest, that is not subject to market forces, and where the market failure occurs time after time after time, and we've seen it occur time after time after time in all those examples that I just outlined, then when will we learn the lesson that this does not work? And I'll put it on the record, there was a point in time where the Labor Party was falling for some of this stuff a long time ago. But the difference between this side of the House and that side of the House is that we actually learnt the lesson that it doesn't work. And we actually looked at it and said, well, in circumstances where it's not subject to competition, and in circumstances where the public's not going to benefit, the government should, in fact, own these things on behalf of the New South Wales people. And we need to think long and hard before we enter into these privatisation transactions, because, number one, you're transferring an asset in the hands of the New South Wales public. It's not our asset. It's not the Parliament's asset. It's not the government's asset. It's the asset of the people of New South Wales, and we are simply managing it on their behalf. We are the stewards of that asset on their behalf, and we are brokering decision-making via the inputs we get through the electoral system as to what we do with it. And the idea that you would go and sell that asset off, and, you know, we've had bills in this House which mandated, which we've put up, which said that if you're going to privatise any further assets, we want agreement from both sides of Parliament. Rejected on all occasions by that side. That is a very, very simple, sensible, straightforward proposition, that if you're going to sell the public's assets, you should have the permission of both houses of Parliament to pass that privatisation bill. Rejected. Why? Because the executive arm of government, controlled by the Liberal and National Party, still wants the right to privatise assets after all we've been through, after the disastrous sale of electricity assets, after the disastrous sale of the bus system. This is another example, Mr. President. This is another example, Mr. President. The litany of failure is endless. We've privatised all the bus services now, and for people who are on that inquiry with me, we heard the litany of evidence about delayed buses, buses not arriving at all, fares going up, people being forced onto infrastructure which wasn't properly patronised. And so, despite all these lessons, and this being the exemplar lesson, that is that we sold a port off where we had to put artificial restrictions on to satisfy 2 other people that we sold the ports to in order to make it stack up, and then having to unravel the deal and potentially putting the public on the hook for the compensation, because we don't know whether or not the government will actually have to kick in to compensate the Port of Newcastle now for this, to compensate, sorry, Port Botany and Port Kembla for this. It's just unconscionable. Now, it would be somewhat forgivable if during the debates we've had over the last couple of weeks, if the government said, look, you know what, we actually agree with you, we think this has gone too far, we will not pursue this privatisation any further, and we're going to neutralise it as an election issue because we actually think you're right and we think you're on a winner here. So guess what? We're going to agree with you. Let's pass the bill that says that if you're going to privatise any more of these assets, it has to be passed by both houses of Parliament. But no, the government doubles down and in fact is proud of their record. Again, bringing up the recycling proposition. The new intercity fleet, which has been raised several times in this House, and now I think we're going to have a repeat of it with the new regional fleet, whereby well, with all due respect, I acknowledge the interjection, Mr. President, in terms of relevance. There is a contextual background here that we're talking about, and that is on the validity of privatisation. And as I've said in my introductory comments, the sale of the Port of Newcastle is the emblematic exemplar failure of privatisation. And my argument is that you would think they would learn from the litany of lessons, but no. The new intercity fleet has cost overruns of over $1 billion because of the safety issues, to the Honourable Sam Farraway's point in terms of the relationship to trains. This is a broader debate about the effective use of taxpayers' money, Mr. President. If you're going to sell assets off, surely the Parliament needs to question the value and validity of that sale in the context of the public benefit. Now, the government's argument, part of the government's argument for privatisation, not in the case of Port Kembla. In the case of Port Kembla, it's fairly straightforward. They had this, what they thought was this short-term cosy arrangement to limit the container movements to 50,000, and then after years of practice have realised what an abject failure it is and have caused market dysfunctionality by placing that restriction, then they have to undo it and potentially pay compensation. That is a really bad use of taxpayers' assets and money. Another example of a really bad use of selling taxpayers' assets and squandering money is the purchase of foreign-owned trains, whereby defect upon defect was borne upon the New South Wales taxpayer to the tune of $1 billion, where trains didn't fit tracks, didn't fit tunnels, had to be retrofitted to fix safety issues, CCTV, so the guards could properly see. We know all about these atrocious decisions, and it just goes to show that the government hasn't learned from an obsession with privatising these goods and services. So the linkage with the trains, Mr. President, is that they sold assets on the promise that they would recycle them into productive infrastructure, in this case transport infrastructure, for the benefit of the New South Wales taxpayer. And again, just like with the electricity example, I don't think any New South Wales taxpayer would look at this and think they got a good deal from the sale of those assets, which were then recycled into dodgy infrastructure. The cracked trams in the inner west is another good example. And in the debate yesterday, we heard about how they're doubling down and using the same Spanish company to make the new regional fleet. And we're being told by the stakeholders in that area, the villains of this whole debate, the RTBU, the subject matter experts with people on the ground, that NRF is about to go down the same path as the NIF because they've made the same mistakes. They haven't spoken to the people on the ground who knew about these things. So going back to this again, now we're supporting this because there's obviously market dysfunctionality in the Port of Newcastle because of that deal that the government did, and now they've got to unravel it. And let's not make the imperfect the enemy of some sort of progress. But this is not ideal. And it's not ideal because the New South Wales taxpayer expect value for their money. And when you're going to privatise an asset, they expect demonstrable gains for that asset. And the sale of the Port of Newcastle, as I've said before, is the exemplar of the failure of privatisation. And it wouldn't matter as much, of course it would still matter, but it wouldn't matter as much if that side of government, if that side of the parliament had learnt their lesson and agreed to stop the privatisation obsession. But they haven't. They're going headlong into this election campaign with a desire to continue to sell off assets. And where does it stop? Are you going to sell off the rest of Ausgrid? You won't rule it out. Are you going to sell off the rest of Endeavour Energy? You won't rule it out. Are you going to sell off the rural electricity provider? Are you going to sell off the rural electricity provider, Essential Energy? You won't rule it out. Are you going to sell off the trains network? You won't rule it out. Well, Mr. President, after the litany of failures of privatisation we've seen, including this sale of the Port of Newcastle, which we've now had to unravel, I think it's about time they learnt their lesson and stopped the obsession with privatisation.